Okay, in this video, we're going to talk about what a Boolean variable is in a little more detail. We've mentioned that in our previous video or our previous set of notes on variables in general. Now we're going to focus in on Booleans a little bit. And we're going to talk about how Booleans are used in a conditional statement and the way conditional statements work in general. I will say that conditional statements are a huge part of programming. I can't think of very many programs this year that you won't use a conditional statement in this someplace. So this is going to be one of our first really big major topics that you're going to see over and over and over again this year. So with that said, let's go ahead and get started by looking at some learning objectives. There we go. All right, so here are our learning objectives for this video. Understand how Boolean variables are unique. Understand how a logical test can be used to generate Boolean variables. Understand how the three kinds of conditional statements work, and use a logical test with a conditional statement to control flow in a program. All right, so those are our 4 learning objectives. Just as a reminder, don't forget, you know how to hit the pause button on this video. So if I'm going too fast, if you want to jot those down, hit pause, get those written down, and then go ahead and push play as we move on. All right. So here's our next slide. The next thing we're going to talk about is Boolean variable, or I should say the first thing we're going to talk about, Boolean variables specifically. So this we talked about in our discussion on variables. Booleans are a specific kind of variable that can only have 2 values. Either they're true or they're false. Those are the only options. So this particular, if we want to go back to our piece of paper analogy, if a variable is like a piece of paper, this is a piece of paper that it's kind of like a, check yes or no kind of paper, right? You get the little note from the girl who likes you or the boy who likes you back when you're in 4th grade, 5th grade. I don't know. We did this back when I was that age. You guys probably send text or whatever nowadays or whatever, right? I don't know. Do you have phones in 4th grade? I don't know. But anyway, if you think of this, check yes, check no, and that's the only information that this piece of paper is allowed to hold. So there could be a check true box, there could be a check false box, check which one. If you like me, check true, whatever, right? So that's the kind of thing that we're talking about here. A piece of paper, a variable, that can only say true or false, and those are the only 2 options. All right. Where do we use it? Well, we can certainly use it anytime we're dealing with things that only have 2 states. Okay, so is something on or something off? Is something true or something false? Is something even or something odd? Different situations like that are situations where we might use a Boolean. Okay, logical tests are what we're going to focus on in this video because that's what we tend to use with conditional statements. Logical test is something true or something false. So, for example, in math class, you might see a logical test like 5 is less than 7. Is that a true statement or is that a false statement? Well, 5 is less than 7. That's a true statement. So that's an example of a logical test. And then you'll see specifically, we'll use those logical tests with conditional statements to control flow in a program. Now, this is the first time we've really talked about flow. Flow just means the way the program goes through the different steps. Okay, so typically a program, once an event handler clicks into action, once there's an event that causes an event handler to fire, typically what happens is the program just starts at the top of the event handler and it goes straight down in order. But there are things we can do that would make it skip certain steps or loop back around and do certain steps more than once and things like that. That's the idea of controlling flow. And specifically, a conditional statement is something that's going to let you skip steps. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. Let's keep going with the slides here. So flow. Here's our definition of flow. Determining which steps of the program get done and what order they get done. Okay, so that kind of is what I just said. Right? As you move down the event handler, typically we do every single step in order, but with certain time, in certain situations, we can modify the flow so that it skips steps or it loops around and does things over and over again. So we change which ones get done or we change what order they get done. All right, and that's basically what this one says. Okay. Conditional statements. So how conditional statements help with that? So what a conditional statement does is it controls flow by determining whether or not you're going to do a certain step. So in a conditional statement, the reason why it's called a conditional statement is under certain conditions, it will do the step. And under different conditions, it will skip the step. And that's the idea of a conditional statement. There's two basic kinds, although in this video we'll see that we can modify the second kind to kind of embellish and get more things going on. But the two basic kinds are if then. So the way that works is if the condition is true, then you do the step. And then there's an if then else. So this gives you an opportunity to deal with two conditions. So if it's true, then do this. If it's not true, then do that. Okay, and that's the way an if then else statement works. If it's true, then do this, else, otherwise, if it's not true, then do something else. Okay, so that's the idea there. Like I said, there is another one, the if then else if. It's kind of a hybrid type. We'll talk a little bit about that, and we will use it in our class, but it's a little bit more advanced. And in this video, I'm not going to get into that too much. All right, so if then statements, let's get some details on how these work. First of all, the if-then statement will start with a test that determines a Boolean value. Okay, so there will be a logical test at the beginning, and the logical test will either be true or be false. So notice those are Boolean values. It's either true or it's false. That's a Boolean. So we'll use a test to create a Boolean value. And that Boolean value will decide whether or not we do a step. Okay, so here's an example where I just skipped the step and I just simply have shown the Boolean value. So right here is where your test would be. So let's pretend there's a test here that happens to be true. So maybe the test is something like 10 is greater than 1. Okay, 10 is greater than 1. That's a true statement. So here we have a test that was true. And what you can see this thing is doing is if the test is true, then it's going to set this variable to be equal to 1. Okay, that's the way that that particular thing works. So the variable is initialized to be 0, but if the test is true, then it sets the variable to be equal to 1. All right, so that's the basic idea of an if-then statement. Of course, the other piece of this is what if the test is false? Okay, well, if the test is false, then it's going to, well, this is a repeat. If it's true, then do these things, okay? So that's what the blocks are showing here. If it's true, then you do it, all right? So that's a little redundant from the first slide, but here's the third part. Here's the main thing. If the statement is false, then you skip it, then you ignore it. So here, my Boolean value is false. So whatever is inside of this, and just like any sort of control feature, there can be multiple blocks inside of here. There doesn't have to be just one. There can be multiple blocks. Anything that's in that slot will get skipped if the Boolean value is false, okay? So again, this is going to be some sort of logical test that creates a Boolean value. If the test creates a value that's false, then this step will get skipped and it will just move on to whatever comes next. All right, if then else statements. I was kind of giving you a little bit of background on this before, but let's go into some detail with it now. First of all, this is what they look like. And in this case, what it's doing is giving you two sets of instructions. It's going to do one or it's going to do the other, but it won't do both. Okay, so it'll do one or it'll do the other, but it won't do both. So this is determining which set of directions to follow. A regular if then just decides should you do it or not. So there's only one set of directions. It's either going to do it or skip it. If then else gives you two set of directions. It's going to do one or the other depending on the Boolean value. All right, so let's look at the next slide so we can see how this works. If the Boolean value is true, then it does the first part. So notice the first part is the then part. So really, this part is working just like a normal if-then statement. When the Boolean is true, it does this. But it's also going to skip this part. Because remember, with an if-then-else block, it's only going to do one set of directions. So when it's true, it does the first set, and it skips the second set. Okay? And you can probably infer then, so when it's false, it's going to skip the then part, just like a regular if-then statement would do. When it's false, it skips the then part, and it moves down here, and it does the else part, is what it does. Okay? So that's the idea of an if-then-else block. It's either going to do one set or it's going to do the other, but it's not going to do both. Okay? Now, with if-then-else statements, if we use an else if, we can insert else ifs in between the then and the else. Okay, so here's a normal if then else block, and I've inserted into it 2 else if statements. So this works kind of like an if then statement inside of an if then statement. So the way this would work is if the statement is true, it does the first statement and it skips everything else. Okay. If the statement is false, it skips the first statement and it moves to the next test. If that test is true, it does it and it skips everything else. But if that test is false, it skips it and it moves to the next test. If all of the tests are false, it'll do the very last thing. Okay, so in this case, the first one's false, so it skips the global variable equals 1. The second one is false, so it skips global variable equals 2. The third one is true, so it makes the variable equal 3. It does this line, and then it skips the fourth one. And that's how an else if statement works. Okay. So we can use a logical test to create the Boolean value. And that's kind of what I was saying. Normally, when you look at these blocks, it's not just simply a true false block like this. It's not just simply a Boolean value. It's actually a test that creates a Boolean value. So here's an example of a test. This is an equals test. Does 0 equal 1? So this is not claiming that 0 is equal to 1. This is not like an equal sign like you use it in math class, where it's declaring, hey, these things are equal. This is a question mark. This is a test. Is 0 equal to 1? No, it's not. So this is a false statement. And so it's going to set the Boolean value to equal false. Okay? If the statement was true, it would set it to be true. Okay, so here's an example where it's going to set it to be true. 0 is less than 1. So again, this is a test. It's a question. It's not a statement of fact. It's a test. Is 0 less than 1? Yes, it is. So this generates a Boolean value that's equal to true. And because it's a true statement, it will do the then part of your program. Okay, so that's the way that we'll use a logical test to create a Boolean value to drive whether or not a conditional statement works. Okay, so that's the basic idea. Let's take a quick look in App Inventor just to make sure that we know where these blocks are and how they work. Okay, all our if-then blocks are in the control tool drawer. So there's our if-then else, our if-then else if. Actually, all 3 of them are there. They're redundant because look at this. If I pull this out, notice how all 3 of them have this little blue gear in the corner. That little blue gear is a settings feature that lets you change things. So if I click on that blue gear, notice I can turn it into an if then else just by dragging that out. Now it's an if then else block. If I click on that blue gear, I can make it into an if then else if block. So now it's an if then else if block. Okay, and if I decide, oh, I didn't really want it to be an else if, I can just drag it back over here to delete it. Maybe I did want to keep the else, whatever, but every one of these blocks can be manipulated. Okay, your logical tests are in the 3 drawers for your different kinds of variables. If you're working with Booleans, then you just use a regular logical test here. Is it true? Is it false? Is it equal? Is it not equal? Okay, these types of things. If I'm working with numbers, so floats and integers, then I will use this test block. And notice this test block, it's just equal, but if I hit that arrow, I can make it not equal, I can make it less than, greater than, all the way down, okay? And then for my third type, or my final type of variable, for strings, I can pull this out, and this will compare strings. So if I'm using less than or greater than, that's like comparing alphabetical order. Is A less than B or is A greater than B, right? That kind of a thing. And then equal sign, that's kind of like passwords. Remember we talked about with strings, a capital A is different than a lowercase a. So if I put capital A and I put lowercase a, they will not be equal. And this is going to give me a false value. Okay, so those are all the blocks. That's the basic idea of if-then statements and conditional tests. So hopefully that helps for this portion of the notes and this portion of our class. Obviously, in the next app that you do, you're going to be working with the conditional statements a fair amount. Okay, so I think that takes care of it for now. Thanks for watching this video. Have a good one.